What happens when the most elite warriors walk among us unrecognized? Sometimes it takes a moment of mistaken identity to reveal the extraordinary people hiding in plain sight. This is the story of how two police officers learnt that assumptions can be dangerous, and how one woman's quiet strength reminded an entire community what true service really means. The morning sun cast long shadows across the empty parking lot of the federal building in downtown Seattle. Sarah Martinez sat on the concrete steps, her withered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee from the food truck across the street. To anyone passing by, she looked like just another person seeking shelter from the cool Pacific Northwest air. Her worn jeans, faded hoodie, and scuffed boots told a story that most people would quickly categorize and dismiss. What they couldn't see was the story written in the careful way she positioned herself with a clear view of all entrances, or how her eyes constantly scanned the perimeter with practiced precision. They couldn't know about the small scar above her left eyebrow from a training accident in Coronado, or the way her shoulders still carried themselves with military bearing despite her casual clothes. Sarah had been waiting for 3 hours. The federal agents she was supposed to meet weren't due until noon, but old habits die hard. In her world, being early wasn't just punctuality, it was survival. She'd rather spend a morning on cold concrete than risk missing something important. The irony wasn't lost on her, that she was about to train federal agents in counter-surveillance techniques while being surveilled herself. She'd noticed the security cameras, of course, and the way the building's guards had been watching her through the glass doors. It was natural, she supposed. A woman sitting alone outside a government building for hours would draw attention in today's world. What she hadn't expected was the patrol car that pulled up to the curb with its lights flashing. Officer Mike Chen stepped out first, his hand resting casually on his belt. His partner, Officer Rebecca Torres, emerged from the passenger side, already reaching for her notepad. They were both young, probably mid-20s, with the kind of eager energy that marked them as relatively new to the force. "Ma'am, we need you to stand up slowly and keep your hands where we can see them," Chen called out, his voice carrying the authority he'd been taught to project. Sarah didn't move immediately. Instead, she took a slow sip of her coffee and studied the two officers approaching her. She could see the tension in their shoulders, the way Torres was positioning herself for backup. The slight tremor in Chen's voice that suggested he was more nervous than he wanted to appear. "Is there a problem, officers?" Sarah asked calmly, not moving from her position on the steps. "We've received reports of suspicious activity," Torres said, stepping closer. "You've been sitting here for several hours. This is federal property, and loitering is not permitted." Sarah almost smiled. She'd been called many things in her 15 years of military service, but suspicious was a new one. She slowly stood up, keeping her movements deliberate and non-threatening. Years of training had taught her how to read a situation, and she could see these officers were wound tight. "I'm waiting for a meeting," she said simply. "I have identification if you need to see it." Chen and Torres exchanged glances. They'd been patrolling this area for 6 months, and they knew the usual crowd. The homeless individuals who sometimes sought shelter in doorways, the occasional protester, the tourists who got lost looking for Pike Place Market. This woman didn't fit any of those categories. But she also didn't look like someone who belonged in a federal building. "Let's see that ID," Torres said, her tone softer now but still official. Sarah reached slowly into her back pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. She handed over her driver's license without comment, watching as Torres examined it carefully. "Sarah Martinez, age 38. Address in Tacoma." Torres read aloud for her partner's benefit. "Says here you're a security consultant." "That's right," Sarah confirmed. Chen looked at the federal building behind them, then back at Sarah. "What kind of meeting are you having in there?" "The kind I can't discuss with unauthorized personnel," Sarah replied. There was no hostility in her voice, just a matter-of-fact statement that made both officers pause. Torres handed back the license. "Look, Ms. Martinez, we're just doing our job here. You've been sitting on these steps since before dawn. The security guards inside are concerned, and frankly, so are we. If you have legitimate business here, why don't you go inside and wait?" Sarah tucked her license back into her wallet. "Because the building doesn't open to visitors until 10, and my contact isn't arriving until noon. I don't mind waiting outside." "In this weather?" Chen asked, gesturing to the grey sky that threatened rain. "I've waited in worse places," Sarah said quietly. Something in her tone made Torres look at her more carefully. There was a quality to the way Sarah carried herself, a stillness that seemed practiced rather than natural. Torres had grown up in a military family. Her father had been Army, her uncle Navy, and she was beginning to recognize something familiar in this woman's bearing. "Have you served?" Torres asked suddenly. Sarah's expression didn't change. "Yes." "What branch?" "Navy." Chen was growing impatient. "Look, military or not, you still can't loiter on federal property. We're going to need you to move along or go inside once the building opens." Sarah nodded slowly. "I understand you have a job to do, Officer Chen." She'd read his nameplate while he was talking. "But I also have a job to do, and it requires me to be here at a specific time." "I'm not causing any disturbance. I'm not blocking access to the building, and I'm not violating any laws." Torres stepped forward. "Actually, you are. City Ordinance 122-5080 prohibits remaining in any public place for an extended period without lawful business." "And I have lawful business," Sarah replied calmly. "That you can't tell us about," Chen added with skepticism. "That's correct." The standoff continued for several minutes, with neither side willing to back down. Sarah remained perfectly calm, while the two officers grew increasingly frustrated. They'd dealt with difficult people before, but this was different. Sarah wasn't argumentative or hostile. She was simply immovable. Finally, Torres made a decision. "We're going to need you to come with us for questioning." "On what charges?" Sarah asked. "Loitering, trespassing on federal property, and failure to comply with a lawful order," Chen said, reaching for his handcuffs. Sarah held up a hand. "Before you do something you might regret, let me make a phone call." "You can make a call from the station," Torres said. "This call might save us all some time and embarrassment," Sarah replied. She pulled out an old flip phone, the kind that made Torres and Chen exchange another glance. Who used flip phones anymore? Sarah dialed the number from memory and waited. "Agent Morrison, it's Sarah Martinez. I'm outside the federal building for our noon meeting, but I seem to have run into a small problem with local law enforcement." She paused, listening. "Yes, I'll put them on." She held out the phone to Torres. "Agent Morrison would like to speak with you." "This is Officer Torres, Seattle PD." She listened for a moment, her expression changing from skepticism to confusion to something approaching embarrassment. "Yes, sir, I understand." "No, sir, we haven't." "Yes, sir, right away." She handed the phone back to Sarah, who closed it without another word. "What did he say?" Chen asked his partner. Torres looked from Sarah to the federal building and back again. "He said Miss Martinez is here on official business and that we should extend her every courtesy." She paused. "He also said that if we interfere with her work, we'll be answering to the Department of Homeland Security." Chan's eyes widened. "Homeland Security?" Sarah finished the last of her coffee and crumpled the cup. "Officers, I appreciate you doing your job, really. But mine is a bit more complicated than it might appear." "What exactly do you do?" Torres asked, her curiosity now overriding her official duties. Sarah looked at both officers for a long moment, as if weighing her words carefully. "I teach people how to stay alive in dangerous situations." "Like a self-defense instructor?" Chen asked. "Something like that." Torres wasn't satisfied. Her military background was nagging at her, telling her there was much more to this story. "You said Navy. What did you do in the Navy?" Sarah's lips quirked in what might have been a smile. "I swam." Swam, among other things, before either officer could ask more questions. A black SUV pulled up to the curb. Two men in dark suits got out, and Sarah recognized Agent Morrison immediately. He was tall, graying at the temples, with the kind of serious expression that came from years of federal law enforcement. "Ms. Martinez," Morrison called out as he approached. "I hope there hasn't been any trouble." "Just a misunderstanding," Sarah replied, nodding toward the two officers. Morrison looked at Torres and Chen with the kind of measuring gaze that made them both stand a little straighter. "Officers, thank you for your vigilance." "Ms. Martinez is here at the request of the federal government to provide specialized training to our personnel." "What kind of training?" Chen found himself asking, even though he suspected he shouldn't. Morrison and Sarah exchanged a look. "The kind that keeps agents alive in the field," Morrison said finally. Torres was putting pieces together in her head. Navy, swimming, specialized training, federal agents. "Ma'am," she said slowly, "were you a SEAL?" Sarah looked at Torres with new interest, noting the way the young officer had connected dots that most people wouldn't even see. "That's classified," Sarah said simply. But her non-answer was answer enough. Torres felt her world shift slightly as she realized what she was looking at. Standing in front of her was someone who had been through some of the most rigorous training in the world, someone who had likely seen combat in places she couldn't imagine, someone who had dedicated their life to serving their country in ways that would never make the headlines. Chen was slower to catch on, but when he did, his entire demeanor changed. "Ma'am, we didn't know. If we had known who you were, you did exactly what you should have done," Sarah interrupted firmly. "You saw something that didn't look right and you investigated. That's good police work." Morrison checked his watch. "Ms. Martinez, we should head inside. The team is waiting." Sarah nodded and turned back to the two officers. "Officers Chen and Torres, thank you for your service to this community. What you do matters, even when it seems routine." As she turned to leave with Morrison and his partner, Torres called out, "Ma'am, can I ask what you're teaching them in there?" Sarah paused at the entrance to the federal building. For a moment, she seemed to consider whether to answer. Then she looked back at the two young officers who had been doing their job trying to keep their city safe. "I'm teaching them to see what's really there," she said finally. "Not what they expect to see, but what's actually in front of them." With that, she disappeared into the federal building, leaving Torres and Chen standing by their patrol car, both lost in thought. Torres was the first to speak. "Do you realize what just happened?" Chen shook his head slowly. "I think we just tried to arrest someone who could probably take us both down without breaking a sweat." "That's not what I mean," Torres said. "Did you see the way she handled that whole situation? She never got angry, never got defensive, never tried to intimidate us with her background. She could have told us who she was from the beginning, but she didn't. She let us do our job." Chen thought about that. "Why? Because that's what people like her do," Torres replied. "They protect others, even when those others don't know they need protecting." Inside the federal building, Sarah was following Morrison down a long corridor, lined with official portraits and agency seals. They passed through multiple security checkpoints, each one requiring different levels of clearance. Finally, they arrived at a conference room where a dozen federal agents were waiting. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison announced, "this is Sarah Martinez. For the next 3 days, she'll be teaching you surveillance and counter-surveillance techniques that could save your lives in the field." The agents looked at Sarah with varying degrees of curiosity and skepticism. She was smaller than most of them, older than some, and dressed like she'd just come from running errands. It wasn't what they'd expected from someone brought in to teach elite federal agents. Sarah set her small backpack on the conference table and looked around the room, making brief eye contact with each agent. She could read them like a book. The ones who were already dismissive, the ones who were withholding judgment, the few who had enough experience to recognize that appearances could be deceiving.
"How many of you have been in situations where you were conducting surveillance on a target?" she asked.
All hands went up. "How many have been in situations where you later discovered that your target was aware of your surveillance?" About half the hands remained raised. "How many have been in situations where your target was not only aware of your surveillance but was actively using it to their advantage?" Now only 3 hands stayed up. Sarah nodded. "Those 3 of you have learned something important. The others are about to." She moved to a whiteboard at the front of the room and drew a simple diagram, a circle with several dots around it. "Most people think surveillance is about watching without being seen. That's amateur hour. Real surveillance, the kind that keeps you alive and gets results, is about understanding the entire environment. It's about reading patterns, recognizing anomalies, and most importantly, knowing when you've become part of someone else's pattern." One of the agents, a young man who looked like he'd come straight from the academy, raised his hand. "Ma'am, with respect, what makes you qualified to teach federal agents?" "Fair question. Agent Morrison, would you like to answer that, or should I?" "Agent Parker, Ms. Martinez spent 15 years in naval special warfare. She's conducted operations in 17 countries, most of which are still classified. She's been shot at, bombed, and hunted by people who make the criminals you chase look like Sunday school teachers. And she's still here to teach you what she learned." Parker looked embarrassed. "I didn't mean any disrespect, ma'am." "None taken," Sarah replied. "But let me ask you something, Agent Parker. What did you notice about me when I walked in here?" Parker looked confused. "Ma'am, humor me. Describe what you observed." Parker glanced around at his colleagues, clearly uncomfortable being put on the spot. "You're small, older than I expected. Dressed casually. What else? I don't know." Sarah turned to another agent. "Agent Williams, what did you notice?" Williams, an older woman with graying hair, thought for a moment. "You scanned the room when you came in. You positioned yourself with your back to the wall. You set your bag where you could reach it quickly, but where it wouldn't impede movement. Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile any of them had seen. Agent Williams has been paying attention. Agent Parker, you saw what you expected to see. Agent Williams saw what was actually there. She turned back to the whiteboard. This is the first lesson, and it's the most important one you'll learn in the next 3 days. Your brain is constantly making assumptions based on incomplete information. Most of the time, those assumptions keep you safe, but sometimes they get you killed. The room was completely quiet now. Even the skeptics were paying attention. 3 hours ago, I was sitting outside this building, waiting for our meeting. 2 police officers approached me because I didn't fit their pattern of what belonged there. They were doing their job, but they were also making assumptions. She moved away from the whiteboard and walked slowly around the room as she talked. They assumed that because I was dressed casually and sitting alone, I was either homeless or up to no good. They assumed that because I couldn't immediately explain my business here, I was being evasive. They assumed that because I didn't look like their idea of someone who would have legitimate business in a federal building, I didn't belong. She stopped behind Agent Parker's chair. What they didn't assume was that I might be exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was supposed to be doing. Parker shifted uncomfortably in his seat.
Now, Sarah continued, I want you to imagine that instead of being here to teach you, I was here to harm you.
Imagine that my goal was to get inside this building and cause damage. Do you think those assumptions might have worked in my favor? The room was dead silent as the implications sank in. The people you're going to be up against, the real threats, they understand how assumptions work. They know how to dress, how to behave, how to blend in. They study you just as carefully as you study them, and they use your expectations against you. Agent Morrison stepped forward. Miss Martinez, perhaps you could give them a demonstration. Sarah nodded. Agent Parker, I want you to leave the room and come back in 5 minutes. When you return, I want you to tell me everything you observe about this room and the people in it. Parker looked confused, but followed instructions. After he left, Sarah quickly rearranged some items on the table, had 2 agents switch seats, and positioned herself differently in the room. When Parker returned, he stood in the doorway and looked around carefully. The chairs have been moved. Agents Miller and Johnson switched places. You moved from the front of the room to the back corner. Good, Sarah said. What else? Parker studied the room more carefully. Someone moved the water pitcher. The window blinds are angled differently. You're learning to look beyond your first impression. But you missed the most important change. Parker looked around again, clearly frustrated. I don't see anything else. Sarah walked to the center of the room. Agent Williams left. Everyone turned to look at Agent Williams' empty chair. She had slipped out while Parker was focused on the obvious changes. This is what I mean about assumptions, Sarah said. You assumed that the changes you could see were the only changes that mattered. You didn't account for what wasn't there anymore. The demonstration continued for the rest of the morning, with Sarah putting the agents through increasingly complex exercises designed to challenge their assumptions and sharpen their observational skills. By lunch break, even the most skeptical agents were beginning to understand that they were learning from someone extraordinary. As the agents filed out for lunch, Agent Morrison approached Sarah. That was impressive. You've got their attention now. Sarah was packing up her materials. Getting their attention is easy. The hard part is keeping them alive long enough to use what they learn. Is it really that dangerous out there? Sarah looked at Morrison with the kind of expression that comes from seeing too much. Agent Morrison, in my experience, it's not the dangers you can see that kill you. It's the ones you never saw coming. Outside the federal building, Officers Torres and Chen were finishing their patrol shift, but neither could stop thinking about their encounter that morning. I keep thinking about what she said, Torres said as they walked back to their patrol car. About seeing what's really there, instead of what we expect to see. Chen nodded. Makes you wonder what else we're missing, doesn't it? As they drove back to the station, they passed the federal building, where Sarah Martinez was teaching some of the country's most elite agents lessons that could save their lives. Neither officer knew the details of what was happening inside, but they both understood that they had witnessed something important that morning. They had met someone who had dedicated her life to serving others. Someone who carried herself with quiet dignity and unshakable purpose. Someone who had been willing to let 2 young police officers do their job, even when it meant being treated with suspicion and disrespect. You know what the real lesson was today? Torres said finally. What's that? Heroes don't always look like heroes. Chen thought about that as they pulled into the police station parking lot. No, he agreed, they don't. The second day of training began at 6 in the morning, well before most of the federal building's staff arrived for work. Sarah had requested the early start time, explaining that real threats didn't operate on business hours. The agents filed into the same conference room, but this time they found it completely transformed. All the furniture had been rearranged to create different sightlines and hiding spots. The lights were dimmed, and several objects had been placed around the room in seemingly random positions. Sarah stood at the back of the room, barely visible in the shadows. Yesterday, we talked about seeing what's really there. Her voice came from the darkness. Today, we're going to talk about being invisible while you do it. Agent Parker, who had been humbled by the previous day's demonstrations, raised his hand tentatively. Ma'am, shouldn't we be able to see you to learn from you? In the dim lighting, they had been following Sarah's voice, but now that she'd questioned it, several of them realized they weren't entirely sure where she was standing. This is Lesson 2, Sarah continued, and her voice now seemed to come from a completely different location. Your targets will use every advantage they can get. Poor lighting, background noise, visual obstructions, your own assumptions about how people behave. If you can't adapt to these conditions, you'll lose them before you even know they were there. Agent Williams, who had performed well the day before, spoke up. How do we adapt? The lights came up slightly, revealing Sarah standing in yet another location than where her voice had seemed to originate. You use all your senses, not just your eyes. You learn to read the environment, not just the target. And you understand that sometimes being invisible isn't about hiding. It's about being so unremarkable that people look right through you. She gestured for the agents to take seats around the room's perimeter. Agent Morrison, tell them about the Martinez incident. Morrison looked uncomfortable. Sarah, I'm not sure that's. It's relevant, Sarah interrupted, and they need to understand what they're up against. Morrison sighed and moved to the front of the room. 3 years ago, we had a federal witness go missing. Maria Santos, an accountant who had been helping us build a case against a major drug trafficking organization. She was supposed to be in protective custody, but one morning her handlers found her safe house empty. The agents listened intently as Morrison continued. We had no idea if she'd been taken, if she'd run, or if she was dead. The trafficking organization had resources, connections, and a history of eliminating witnesses before they could testify. Sarah took over the narrative. The FBI asked me to consult on the case because of my experience with urban tracking and counter-surveillance. What they didn't tell me initially was that they suspected someone inside the Bureau was feeding information to the trafficking organization. Agent Johnson, a veteran with 20 years of experience, leaned forward. So you weren't just looking for a missing witness. You were looking for a leak. Han. Exactly. And I had to do it while working alongside people who might be compromised. Sarah moved to a map of Seattle that had been mounted on one wall. The safe house was here, in Belltown. Maria Santos was last seen at 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday night. By 6 a.m. Wednesday, she was gone. She marked several locations on the map with red pins. These were the locations where her handlers said they had been the previous day. Coffee shops, grocery stores, a pharmacy. All routine stops that would be necessary for someone in protective custody. Agent Parker studied the map. That seems like a lot of exposure for someone who was supposed to be protected. That's what I thought too, Sarah replied. So I started following the same route, visiting the same locations, trying to understand what Maria Santos would have seen, heard, or noticed. She moved away from the map and began walking around the room as she spoke. The first thing I discovered was that the FBI's surveillance protocols for witness protection were predictable. Same coffee shop every morning at the same time. Same grocery store every few days. Same walking route for exercise. Agent Williams shook her head. That's basic operational security failure. Yes, but it gets worse. When I visited these locations, I started noticing things that didn't fit the pattern. A homeless man who was in the same spot every day, but his clothes were too clean. A woman reading a book at the coffee shop who never turned the page. A maintenance worker who seemed to be fixing the same thing multiple times. The room grew quiet as the agents began to understand the implications. I was seeing a surveillance network, Sarah continued. Someone had been watching Maria Santos for weeks, learning her patterns, preparing for the right moment to take her. Morrison picked up the story. But we still didn't know if it was the trafficking organization or if someone inside the Bureau was involved. Sarah had to investigate both possibilities simultaneously. Part 2. I identified change. Sarah returned to the map. I decided to run a test. I convinced Agent Morrison to feed different information to different people within the Bureau. Each person was told that Maria Santos had been moved to a different safe house. She placed blue pins on the map at various locations. Agent Thompson was told she was in Capitol Hill. Agent Lee was told Fremont. Agent Davis was told West Seattle. Agent Morrison and I kept the real location to ourselves. Canary trap, Agent Johnson said with appreciation. Clever. It worked. Within 24 hours, we had surveillance teams watching the Capitol Hill location. But here's where it got interesting. The surveillance team wasn't from the trafficking organization. Agent Parker looked confused. Who was it? Private investigators hired by someone with significant resources and federal connections. Someone who knew how witness protection worked and had access to information about the case. Sarah moved to a whiteboard and began drawing a complex diagram showing relationships between different players in the case. It took me 3 days of counter-surveillance work to identify the source. A federal judge named Harold Morrison, no relation to Agent Morrison, who had been taking money from the trafficking organization for years.
Agent Williams studied the diagram.
How did you confirm it? Sarah smiled grimly. I let him find me. The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Morrison held up a hand for silence. I made myself visible to the surveillance team following me, Sarah explained. I let them think they were tracking me to a new safe house, but instead, I led them to a location where I had set up my own surveillance. She pulled out a tablet and showed them a series of photographs. Judge Morrison met personally with the head of the surveillance team. The photos and audio recordings we gathered were enough to not only save Maria Santos, but to bring down the entire network. Agent Parker raised his hand. What happened to Maria Santos? Was she really missing? That's the best part, Morrison said with a slight smile. She wasn't missing at all. Sarah had moved her to a secure location and was using her disappearance to flush out the leak. Then, Sarah nodded. Maria Santos testified successfully. Judge Morrison was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison, and the trafficking organization lost its most valuable asset in the federal court system. Agent Johnson shook his head in amazement. You orchestrated the whole thing. I used their assumptions against them, Sarah corrected. They assumed that a missing witness meant a failed operation. They assumed that their inside source would continue to have access to information. They assumed that a single consultant wouldn't be able to outmaneuver their entire network. She turned back to face the group. But the most important lesson from this case isn't about deception or counter-surveillance. It's about patience. Agent Williams looked puzzled. Patience? I spent weeks building this operation. Weeks of sitting in coffee shops, walking the same routes, being unremarkable. Most people can't do that. They get impatient, they want results immediately, they take shortcuts. Sarah moved to the window and looked out at the Seattle skyline. In my world, patience isn't just a virtue, it's a survival skill. The person who can wait the longest, watch the most carefully, and act only when the moment is right, is the person who goes home alive. Agent Morrison stepped forward, which brings us to today's exercise. Sarah turned back to the group. You're going to learn how to become invisible in plain sight. We're going downtown, and you're going to follow me without being detected. Agent Parker looked nervous. In public? What if civilians notice? If civilians notice, you've already failed, Sarah replied. The goal isn't to hide from everyone. The goal is to blend in so completely that no one has any reason to look at you twice. She handed each agent a small earpiece and a basic change of clothes. Different hats, jackets, and accessories that would alter their appearance. The rules are simple, she explained. I'm going to walk through Pike Place Market, Pioneer Square, and the waterfront. Your job is to maintain visual contact with me without letting me know you're there. If I spot you, you're out. If you lose me, you're out. If a civilian asks you what you're doing, you're out. Agent Johnson raised his hand. How will we know if you've spotted us? Sarah pulled out the same flip phone she'd used the day before. You'll get a text message with your badge number. The agents exchanged nervous glances. They were used to conducting surveillance in controlled environments with backup teams and radio communication. This was different. One more thing, Sarah added as they prepared to leave. I'll be carrying a small red notebook. If you can tell me what I write in that notebook during our exercise, you pass. If you can't, we'll be doing this exercise again tomorrow. The group made their way out of the federal building and into downtown Seattle. Sarah gave them a 10-minute head start to position themselves before she began walking. What followed was a masterclass in urban camouflage and counter-surveillance techniques. Sarah moved through the crowded streets of Seattle like water flowing around obstacles. always aware of her surroundings but never appearing to look directly at anything. She stopped at a coffee cart and bought a drink, chatting briefly with the vendor about the weather. While she waited, she used the cart's reflective surfaces to scan for anyone who seemed out of place or too interested in her activities. Agent Williams was positioned across the street, pretending to window shop while keeping Sarah in her peripheral vision. She watched as Sarah seemed to write something in the red notebook, but the distance and angle made it impossible to see what. Agent Parker had positioned himself further down the street, trying to anticipate Sarah's route. But when he looked up from checking his phone, Sarah had disappeared entirely. He spent the next 20 minutes searching the area before his phone buzzed with a text. Badge 2847. Try to be less obvious about checking your watch. Agent Thompson was spotted when she followed too closely through Pike Place Market. Agent Davis was made when he stopped walking every time Sarah stopped. Agent Lee was discovered when he tried to photograph Sarah writing in her notebook. Only Agent Williams and Agent Johnson managed to avoid detection during the 2-hour exercise. When they all reconvened at a predetermined location in Pioneer Square, Sarah looked pleased with the results. Agent Williams and Agent Johnson, congratulations. You both successfully maintained surveillance without being detected. Can you tell me what I wrote in the notebook? Agent Williams looked frustrated. I saw you writing several times, but I couldn't get close enough to read it without risking exposure. Agent Johnson nodded. Same here. I prioritized not being spotted over gathering intelligence. Sarah smiled and opened the red notebook. I wrote down the badge numbers of everyone I spotted and exactly when and where I spotted them. She showed them the notebook, which contained detailed observations about each agent's surveillance techniques, mistakes, and the specific moments when they had given themselves away. This brings us to today's second lesson, Sarah continued. Surveillance is always a balance between gathering information and avoiding detection. Sometimes you have to make difficult choices about which is more important. Agent Parker, who had been eliminated early, looked dejected. I kept trying to get closer to see what you were writing, but every time I did, I felt like I was being too obvious.
You were, Sarah confirmed.
But your instinct to prioritize intelligence gathering wasn't wrong. In a real situation, you might need to accept some risk of detection in order to get critical information. She closed the notebook and looked at each of the agents. The key is knowing when that trade-off is worth it and when it isn't. Agent Morrison, who had been observing the exercise from a distance, joined the group. What did you think of their overall performance? Sarah considered her words carefully. They're well-trained in traditional surveillance techniques, but they're thinking like law enforcement officers instead of intelligence operatives. What's the difference? Agent Thompson asked. Law enforcement officers are trained to be visible when necessary, to project authority, to take control of situations. Intelligence operatives are trained to be invisible, to observe without influencing, to gather information without changing the environment. She gestured toward the busy square around them. In this environment, you need to think like tourists, shoppers, business people, anyone except federal agents. You need to have a reason to be wherever you are, and that reason needs to be obvious to anyone who might notice you. Agent Williams nodded thoughtfully. We were so focused on watching you that we forgot to act like we belonged there. Exactly. When you're conducting real surveillance, you're not just watching your target. You're becoming part of the environment in a way that's completely natural and unremarkable. Sarah led the group to a nearby coffee shop where they could debrief the exercise in more detail. As they settled around the large table, she pulled out a small digital recorder. I want each of you to describe what you observed during the exercise. Not about me, but about everything else. The people around you, the environment, anything that caught your attention. Agent Parker went first.
Honestly, I was so focused on trying to keep track of you that I didn't notice much else.
Agent Thompson, I noticed that Pike Place Market was more crowded than usual for a Tuesday afternoon. Lots of tourists with cameras.
There was a street musician playing guitar near the fish market. Sarah nodded encouragingly. Good. Agent Davis? There was construction work on First Avenue that was forcing foot traffic into narrower paths. A few people seemed annoyed by the detour. Agent Lee, I saw at least 3 other people who might have been conducting surveillance. They had similar behaviors to us, trying to look casual while obviously watching something. Sarah's expression became more serious. Describe them. Agent Lee thought for a moment. One was a woman in her 40s, business attire, standing near the entrance to Pike Place Market but not going in. She kept checking her phone, but her eyes were scanning the crowd. Another was a man in his 30s, baseball cap and jacket, positioned where he could see multiple street exits. The third was harder to pin down. Older man. Looked like he might be homeless, but his positioning was too strategic. The other agents looked at Agent Lee with surprise. They hadn't noticed any of these individuals. Sarah turned to Agent Morrison. Did you have other teams in the area? Morrison shook his head. This was a closed exercise. Just us. Sarah's demeanor shifted subtly, and the agents could sense a change in the room's atmosphere. What had been a training exercise suddenly felt more serious. Agent Lee, can you describe these individuals in more detail? Over the next few minutes, Agent Lee provided detailed descriptions of the 3 suspicious individuals he had observed. Sarah listened carefully, occasionally asking for clarification about specific details. When Agent Lee finished, Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she turned to Morrison. We need to get back to the federal building, now. What's wrong? Morrison asked. If Agent Lee's observations are accurate, today's exercise wasn't as private as we thought it was. The group quickly left the coffee shop and made their way back to the federal building. Sarah's relaxed demeanor had been replaced by the focused alertness the agents were beginning to recognize as her operational mode. Once they were back in the secure conference room, Sarah pulled out her flip phone and made several quick calls. She spoke in clipped, professional tones, using terminology that the agents didn't recognize. After the last call, she turned to face the group. Agent Lee, your observation skills may have just prevented a serious security breach. Agent Lee looked confused. Ma'am? The 3 individuals you described match the profiles of a known surveillance team that works for a private intelligence firm. They specialize in corporate espionage and have been linked to several foreign intelligence services. Agent Morrison's face went pale. Are you saying we were under surveillance during a counter-surveillance training exercise? It's possible, but there's another possibility that's even more concerning. Sarah moved to the whiteboard and began drawing another diagram. What if today's exercise wasn't the target? What if someone knew that I would be conducting training here this week and used that information to gather intelligence on federal law enforcement capabilities? The implications hit the room like a cold wave. If Sarah was right, then someone with significant resources and inside information had used their training exercise as an opportunity to study how federal agents operated. But how would they know? Agent Thompson asked. Sarah looked at Agent Morrison. That's what we're going to find out. As the afternoon light faded outside the conference room windows, it became clear that what had started as a training exercise was about to become something much more serious. The agents who had come to learn from Sarah Martinez were about to discover that in her world, the line between training and real operations was often thinner than they had ever imagined. Sarah was already planning their next move, but first she needed to make sure that everyone in the room understood what they might be walking into. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had faced real danger many times before. Your advanced training is about to begin. The secure conference room had taken on the atmosphere of a military command center. Sarah had requisitioned additional equipment overnight, and the walls were now covered with photographs, maps, and timeline charts. The federal agents filed in at dawn on the 3rd day to find their instructor transformed from teacher to operational commander. Before we begin, Sarah announced without preamble, I need each of you to understand that what we're dealing with is no longer a training exercise. Agent Morrison has briefed me on the security protocols for this facility, and I've identified at least 12 potential breach points that weren't properly secured. Agent Williams looked around the room at the new equipment and documentation. Ma'am, what exactly are we looking at? Sarah moved to a large photograph mounted on the central board. It showed the 3 suspicious individuals Agent Lee had spotted the day before, but these were clearer images taken from security cameras around the federal building. Meet Victor Petrov, Anna Chen, and Michael Rodriguez. They're part of a private intelligence firm called Meridian Solutions, which officially provides corporate security consulting. Unofficially, they sell surveillance capabilities to the highest bidder. Agent Johnson studied the photographs. How do you know all this? Because I've encountered them before, Sarah replied grimly. 2 years ago in Prague, when they were working for a group trying to compromise NATO intelligence operations. They're very good at what they do. Agent Morrison entered the room carrying a thick folder. I've got the background reports you requested. Meridian Solutions has contracts with at least 6 multinational corporations, but their funding sources are complex. Sarah opened the folder and spread its contents across the conference table. Financial records, corporate filings, and intelligence reports painted a picture of an organization that operated in the gray areas between legitimate business and espionage. The working theory, Sarah continued, is that someone knew about our training schedule and used it as an opportunity to study how federal agents conduct surveillance operations. But there's a bigger problem. She moved to a second board covered with building schematics and security camera locations. While they were watching you, I was watching them. And what I discovered is that they weren't just observing our exercise, they were mapping this entire facility.
The room fell silent as the implications became clear.
Agent Parker raised his hand tentatively. Are you saying they were planning some kind of attack? Not an attack, Sarah corrected. Intelligence gathering. They were identifying security vulnerabilities, camera blind spots, personnel routines, and access points. Everything you'd need to plan a sophisticated intrusion. Agent Thompson leaned forward. An intrusion to steal what? Sarah exchanged a look with Agent Morrison before answering. This building houses federal databases containing information about ongoing investigations, witness protection locations, and undercover operations. If someone gained access to those systems, they could compromise cases worth hundreds of millions of dollars and put countless lives at risk. Agent Lee, whose sharp observations had uncovered the surveillance in the first place, spoke up. What do we do about it? Sarah smiled for the first time in 2 days. We're going to use their own techniques against them. Over the next hour, Sarah outlined a plan that was as audacious as it was complex. The agents would be divided into 3 teams, each with a specific role in what she called a counterintelligence operation. Team Alpha will conduct physical surveillance on the Meridian Solutions team, she explained, but you won't be trying to remain hidden. Instead, you'll be deliberately visible, making them think we're conducting a standard law enforcement investigation. Agent Williams nodded. A decoy operation. Exactly. While they're focused on evading Team Alpha, Team Bravo will be conducting real surveillance using techniques they won't expect from federal agents. She turned to Agent Johnson. You'll be leading Team Bravo. Your job is to identify their operational base, their communication methods, and most importantly, who they're reporting to. Agent Johnson looked nervous. Ma'am, with respect, we've had less than 3 days of training in these techniques, which is why I'll be operating as a separate unit providing oversight and backup for both teams, Sarah replied. Team Charlie, led by Agent Morrison, will be working inside the building to identify and secure the intelligence that Meridian Solutions is likely targeting. Agent Parker raised his hand. What if they're planning to act immediately? What if they're not just gathering intelligence but preparing to move tonight? Sarah's expression became serious. That's why we're going to force their hand. She moved to a computer terminal and pulled up a secure communication system. I'm going to leak information that will make them think their window of opportunity is closing. They'll have to choose between aborting their mission or accelerating their timeline. And if they choose to accelerate? Agent Thompson asked. Then we'll be waiting for them. The operation began at noon. Team Alpha, consisting of Agents Williams, Parker, and Thompson, took positions around downtown Seattle where the Meridian Solutions team had been spotted. Their instructions were to be professionally visible, conducting surveillance that looked official but not overly sophisticated. Team Bravo, led by Agent Johnson and including Agents Lee and Davis, deployed using the urban camouflage techniques Sarah had taught them. Their job was to identify patterns in the Meridian team's movements and communications. Meanwhile, Sarah had positioned herself at a central location where she could monitor both teams while conducting her own surveillance. She had changed her appearance significantly, different clothes, different posture, even different walking patterns, that made her virtually unrecognizable from the woman who had been teaching federal agents for the past 3 days. The first few hours proceeded according to plan. Team Alpha made contact with the Meridian surveillance team, who immediately began evasive maneuvers. Victor Petrov and his team were clearly experienced in counter-surveillance, using reflective surfaces, crowd cover, and route changes to try to shake their federal tails. What they didn't realize was that Team Bravo was watching from positions that had been carefully selected based on Sarah's analysis of the urban environment. While Petrov's team was focused on evading the obvious surveillance, they were walking directly into the coverage zones of agents they couldn't see. Agent Lee, positioned in a coffee shop with a clear view of 3 major intersection points, was the first to spot the pattern. Team Bravo lead, this is Observer 2. Target team is moving in a consistent northeast direction, but they're making regular communication stops. Agent Johnson's voice came through their earpieces. Observer 2, can you identify communication methods? Affirmative. They're using what looks like a standard smartphone, but the calls are very brief. Less than 30 seconds each. Sarah, monitoring from her central position, recognized the significance immediately. Team Bravo, those are status updates to a command center. Short duration means they're using predetermined codes or signals. Agent Davis, positioned near Pioneer Square, reported in. Team Bravo lead. I've got visual on Target 2 entering a building on First Avenue. Appears to be a temporary office space or short-term rental. That's their operational base. Sarah's voice crackled through their earpieces. Team Bravo, maintain observation but do not approach. I'm moving to a support position. As Sarah made her way through downtown Seattle, she reflected on how much had changed since that morning 3 days ago when 2 police officers had questioned her outside the federal building. Those officers had been doing their job, protecting their community based on their training and experience. Now she was doing the same thing, but the stakes were considerably higher. The afternoon progressed with clockwork precision. Team Alpha continued their visible pursuit of the Meridian team, drawing attention and resources while Team Bravo gathered intelligence about their opponent's capabilities and intentions. By 4 p.m., the pattern became clear. Viktor Petrov's team was conducting final reconnaissance of the federal building, confirming access points and timing security patrols. They were planning to move that night. Sarah made the call to Agent Morrison. Team Charlie lead. You need to implement security protocols immediately. They're going operational tonight. Morrison's response was immediate. All teams, this is command. We're moving to Phase 2. Phase 2 was Sarah's contingency plan. Instead of waiting for Meridian Solutions to attempt their intrusion, the federal agents would be waiting inside the building to catch them in the act. But as the sun began to set over Seattle, Sarah realized that Viktor Petrov was more experienced than she had given him credit for. The brief communications his team had been making weren't just status updates to a command center. They were coordinating with additional personnel who had been positioned around the city. Agent Thompson's voice came through with urgent clarity. All teams, I've got multiple new contacts, at least 6 additional personnel moving toward downtown from different directions. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with operations that were about to become significantly more complex. Team Alpha, fall back to secondary positions immediately. Team Bravo, maintain observation but be prepared to withdraw. Agent Johnson's voice was tense. Control, are we looking at a larger operation than anticipated? Affirmative, Team Bravo lead. This isn't just intelligence gathering, they're planning something bigger. Inside the federal building, Agent Morrison and Team Charlie were discovering just how much bigger. As they conducted their security sweep, they found evidence of sophisticated electronic surveillance equipment that had been placed in the building weeks ago. Control, this is Team Charlie lead, Morrison reported. They've had access to this building for an extended period. We're dealing with a long-term intelligence operation, not a one-night intrusion. Sarah processed this information while maintaining her surveillance position. The Meridian Solutions team had been playing a much longer game than anyone had realized. The training exercise had been used as cover, but the real operation had been going on for months. All teams, new assessment, Sarah announced. We're not preventing an intrusion. We're uncovering an ongoing espionage operation. As darkness fell over Seattle, the operation took on a different character. The federal agents found themselves engaged in a real-time intelligence battle with an opponent who had been studying them far longer than they had been studying their opponent. Agent Lee, still positioned in the coffee shop, watched as Viktor Petrov's team began to disperse. But instead of leaving the area, they were taking positions around the federal building. Control, this is Observer 2. Target team is not withdrawing, they're establishing a perimeter. Sarah immediately understood what was happening. All teams abort surveillance operations. This is now a security situation. Team Alpha and Team Bravo return to base immediately. Team Charlie, implement lockdown protocols. But as the federal agents began to withdraw, they discovered that Meridian Solutions had anticipated this response as well. The routes back to the federal building were being watched, and Agent Parker reported being followed by at least 2 unknown individuals. Control, Team Alpha is compromised. We have hostile surveillance on our withdrawal route. Sarah made a quick decision. Team Alpha, do not return to base. Proceed to alternate safe house Alpha 7. Team Bravo, same instructions. Proceed to safe house Bravo 3. Agent Morrison's voice came through the communications system. Control, what about you? Agent Morrison moved up and edging down with an evident set of TA called Sacrifice. Factory, College. She was no longer Sarah Martinez, the consultant teaching surveillance techniques to federal agents. She was Chief Petty Officer Martinez, Naval Special Warfare, conducting a live operation in hostile territory. Team Charlie lead, I'm going operational. Maintain building security and wait for my signal. What followed was a game of cat and mouse through the streets of Seattle that showcased 15 years of elite military training. Sarah used every technique she had learned in naval special warfare schools, from urban navigation to counter-surveillance to tactical psychology. Viktor Petrov was good, but he had learned his skills in corporate espionage and private intelligence work. Sarah had learned hers in places where making a mistake meant not going home. By midnight, she had identified the full scope of the Meridian Solutions operation. It involved 12 personnel, 3 vehicles, and a command center in a rented office space. More importantly, she had identified their client. The intelligence they were gathering wasn't being sold to a foreign government or criminal organization. It was being purchased by a group of multinational corporations who wanted advance warning about federal investigations that might affect their business operations. Sarah made one final call to Agent Morrison. Team Charlie lead, I've got the full picture. Meridian Solutions is running corporate intelligence operations against federal law enforcement. They're selling information about ongoing investigations to companies who want to stay ahead of regulatory actions. How do you want to proceed? Sarah looked at the building where Viktor Petrov's command center was operating. Through the windows, she could see the sophisticated electronic equipment they were using to intercept federal communications. Call the Seattle Police Department. Tell them you need backup for a federal operation. Then call the FBI field office and tell them they've got a major security breach that needs immediate attention. What about you? Sarah smiled in the darkness. I'm going to make sure our friends from Meridian Solutions don't leave town before the cavalry arrives. What happened over the next 2 hours would become the subject of classified reports and internal investigations for months to come. Using techniques that combined her naval special warfare training with the surveillance skills she had been teaching federal agents, Sarah Martinez single-handedly dismantled a sophisticated espionage operation. By the time Seattle police and FBI reinforcements arrived, Viktor Petrov and his entire team were in custody. Their equipment was secured, and their corporate clients were being identified through seized communications. Agent Morrison found Sarah sitting on the steps of the federal building at sunrise, in the same spot where she had been waiting 3 days earlier when officers Torres and Chen had first approached her. How did you do it? Morrison asked as he sat down beside her. Sarah looked out at the Seattle skyline as the morning light began to illuminate the city. I used everything they taught me in the Navy, everything I learned in 15 years of operations, and everything I tried to teach your agents in 3 days, which was that the most important skill in this business isn't learning how to see what's there. It's learning how to be what people need you to be when they need you to be it. Morrison considered this. And what did we need you to be? Sarah stood up and shouldered her small backpack, a woman sitting on some steps waiting for a meeting. As she walked away from the federal building for the last time, Sarah reflected on the strange turn of events that had brought her to this moment. 3 days ago, she had been a consultant hired to teach surveillance techniques. Now she was walking away from one of the most successful counterintelligence operations in recent federal law enforcement history. Her phone, the same flip phone that had puzzled so many people, rang as she reached her car. Martinez. Sarah, it's Morrison. The FBI wants to debrief you on the operation, and they want to discuss a more permanent consulting arrangement. Sarah looked back at the federal building where she had spent the last 3 days. Inside, federal agents were learning lessons that would help them protect their country and their communities. Outside, the city of Seattle was waking up to another day, unaware of the threats that had been neutralized while they slept. Agent Morrison, she said finally. I appreciate the offer, but I think I'm going to take some time off, maybe travel a little. Where are you thinking of going? Sarah smiled as she got into her car. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere I can just be a woman, sitting by herself, not bothering anyone. As she drove through downtown Seattle, Sarah passed the area where officers Torres and Chen had first encountered her.
Dad.
She wondered if they would ever know how their simple act of doing their job had led to uncovering a major espionage operation. Probably not, she decided, and that was okay. Sometimes the most important work happened in the shadows, done by people who would never get credit for their contributions. A few miles outside the city, Sarah pulled over at a roadside diner and ordered coffee and eggs. The waitress was friendly but not intrusive, the kind of person who had learned to let customers sit quietly with their thoughts. As Sarah sat in a booth overlooking the highway, she thought about the lessons of the past 3 days. She had tried to teach federal agents how to see what was really there instead of what they expected to see. But the real lesson, she realized, was much simpler. Everyone has a story. Everyone has skills and experiences that aren't immediately visible. Everyone has something valuable to contribute if others are willing to look beyond surface assumptions. Officers Torres and Chen had seen a woman who didn't belong and investigated. Federal agents had seen a consultant who looked too ordinary to be effective and learned otherwise. Viktor Petrov had seen a target of opportunity and discovered he was facing someone far more dangerous than he had anticipated. Sarah's phone rang again. This time it was a number she didn't recognize. Martinez. "Ma'am, this is Officer Torres, Seattle PD. I hope you don't mind me calling. Agent Morrison gave me your number." Sarah smiled. "Officer Torres, how can I help you?" "I wanted to thank you, ma'am. Agent Morrison told me about what happened with that espionage case. He said it started with observations you made after our encounter outside the federal building. You and Officer Chen were doing your job, Officer Torres. You saw something that didn't look right and you investigated. That's exactly what good police officers do." "Yes, ma'am. But I wanted you to know that our conversation got me thinking about assumptions and how they can affect our work. I've been trying to apply some of those lessons on patrol." "How so?" "Well, yesterday we responded to a call about a suspicious person outside a bank. Young man, poorly dressed, seemed to be watching people use the ATM. My first instinct was to assume he was planning something criminal. And I remembered what you said about seeing what's really there instead of what we expect to see. So instead of immediately confronting him, I observed for a while. Turns out he was waiting for his grandmother to finish her banking so he could help her carry her groceries home." Sarah felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. "That's good police work, Officer Torres. I never would have thought to do that before our conversation. I would have seen a potential threat and acted accordingly. But taking the time to really observe the situation led to a much better outcome. For everyone involved." Sarah agreed. "Yes, ma'am. And I wanted you to know that Officer Chen and I had been talking to other officers about this approach. About taking time to really see what's happening before making assumptions about what we think we're seeing." After the call ended, Sarah sat in the diner for another hour, watching traffic move along the highway. She thought about ripple effects, about how small changes in perspective could lead to better outcomes for everyone. Her 3 days teaching federal agents had ended with a successful counterintelligence operation. But maybe the more important impact would be measured in all the future situations, where those agents would remember to look beyond their first assumptions. And maybe 2 police officers in Seattle would continue to share those lessons with their colleagues, creating a culture of careful observation and thoughtful response that would make their community safer for everyone. Sarah finished her coffee and left a generous tip for the waitress. As she returned to her car, she thought about where to go next. She had enough savings to take several months off, and for the first time in years, she had no obligations or commitments. The highway stretched out in front of her, leading to possibilities she couldn't yet imagine. But whatever came next, she knew she would face it the same way she had faced everything else in her life, with careful observation, thoughtful planning, and the quiet confidence that came from knowing she could handle whatever challenges arose. As she merged onto the interstate, Sarah Martinez, former Navy SEAL, federal consultant, and teacher of hard-earned lessons, drove toward an uncertain future with the same steady determination that had carried her through 15 years of military service and 3 days that had changed more lives than anyone would ever know. Behind her, in Seattle, federal agents continued their important work with new skills and perspectives. Police officers continued protecting their community with enhanced awareness and understanding. And somewhere in the federal prison system, Viktor Petrov and his team were learning their own lessons about the dangers of underestimating quiet women who chose to serve others. The highway signs pointed toward different cities, different possibilities, different adventures. Sarah didn't know where she was going, but she knew she was exactly where she belonged, moving forward, ready for whatever came next, carrying with her the knowledge that sometimes the most important battles are won not through force or aggression, but through patience, observation, and the willingness to see people and situations as they really are.